Hi friends, welcome back to our channel. I'm Steph.
And I am Michelle with Sunnyside Design. Welcome to episode 4 of our basement renovation one-room challenge.
If you've missed any of the previous episodes in this basement renovation, please go check them out in the description below. You may also want to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. We just get excited to show you each week the progress that we're making and can't wait to show you the reveal. Today we are excited to show you how to make your own epoxy countertops. And this is going to be a little bit longer videos. It's kind of broken down into 3 sections, so be sure that you stay tuned through all of it. But the first part will be how we actually fabricated the countertop first. Our middle section is on our first attempt at our pour. It looked cool.
Not what we wanted.
Not what I was going for, so we just started all over. So the last part is this pour, what you see behind us, and we will show you step by step how we achieved this look.
And a big thanks to Total Boat and Wagner for working with us on this project.
We chose to fabricate our countertop out of 3/4 inch MDF. We chose this because it would be a nice, sturdy, and smooth substrate to work with. And we just had it cut right to the depth of the countertop at Home Depot so that we could just transport it home easier, and it just saved us from making the cut at home. We're also going to use a piece of common MDF board molding 11/16 by 1.5 for the front edge of the counter. This will make the counter look a little bit more thick and substantial, like a real slab of marble. We're also picking up some other supplies, some chip brushes, masking tape, and plastic drop cloths to protect the cabinetry. We're going to pour our epoxy in place, and one of the most important things to a successful pour is to work with a level surface. So you'll see that we did need to use some shims to get the countertop level. Just be sure to take the time to do this, because if you don't, you won't be very happy with the results you get. All right, we're ready to cut out the sink, the hole for the sink, and came with a template. This sink can actually be installed over mount or under. I am going to do it under mount, and so I did have to trim my template a little bit, and we Googled how far the counter should hang over, and it's anywhere from 1/8 to 1/4 inch. So we've got the template sized, and we have measured the center of the cabinet and marked that. Now we're ready to put the template in place, trace it, and cut it out. To make the cut for the sink, we first drilled a hole in each corner. We were going to cut the entire sink out with a jigsaw, and that would just allow us to get the blade in there easier, but our blade was crooked and it wasn't going very well, so we ended up using this straight edge and using a circular saw, and it worked pretty well. We were able to cut right up to the drilled hole, and we did this on all 4 sides. We did end up using the jigsaw as well, just to help us get that rounded cut at each of the corners. Then we used 220 grit sandpaper to really smooth out all of the edges, since this would be the undermount sink. I really wanted the epoxy to pour off nice and clean, so it would really look like a legit slab of marble. To get the corners nice and smooth, I took a piece of sandpaper and kind of just wrapped it around my finger and used my finger as the shape and just went up and down. And that worked really pretty well to get the correct curvature and get everything nice and smoothed out. To secure the countertop in place, we just secured it with a couple of 2-inch brads, namely where we had to use the shims to get it level. So we didn't use a whole bunch, just that way if we ever were to change the countertop down the road, we would be able to remove the countertop easily. For the front edge of the countertop, we are going to use this common MDF board. It is 11/16 deep by 1.5 wide, and it's just going to make the edge of the counter look a little bit more substantial and thick. So we also liked that it has this rounded edge so that the epoxy will pour off of it nice and smoothly. So we are cutting them in a miter so that it will just be beautiful all the way around. To secure these molding pieces to the front of the counter, we're going to use wood glue and then also secure it into place with some 2-inch brads. So I'm going to apply this just to the top edge where it's going to meet the MDF. Now I'm going to use my finger like a paintbrush, make sure it's nice and smooth out on there. Okay. The most important thing while doing this is to just be mindful that you are keeping that molding piece flush to the MDF so that you don't have as much sanding to do, because you want this to be a nice smooth surface. Now we're going to use all-purpose Bondo to fill in all of the nail holes and seams in the countertop. The counter was long enough that the 8-foot board of MDF wasn't quite long enough, so you can see here we have a pretty good seam that we had to piece together. But we chose to use Bondo for this because we knew it would sand nice and smooth and you wouldn't be able to see the seam afterward. So if you've never used Bondo before, make sure to open a window. It is super smelly. Wear gloves, and also be sure to only mix what you can use in a couple of minutes because this sets up really quickly. So follow the directions on the can, mix up a small portion, and you should be good to go. The Bondo should be cured in about 15 minutes, depending on the humidity and temperature. So once it has cured, you can take about an 80 grit sandpaper to really knock down any high peaks or ridges in the Bondo. And then once you get it smoothed out, then you can go back in with about a 220 grit sandpaper to get it nice and smooth. The Bondo has been applied on all the seams and sanded smooth. So you can't even tell there was a seam here. It's nice and smooth. And I'm just getting ready to prime the surface. Since wood MDF is a porous substrate, you do need to either prime it before pouring epoxy, or you can do an initial seal coat, which is just a super thin layer of epoxy. This will just prevent any air from moving up through the wood, and it will cause bubbles and lots of trouble for your pouring of epoxy. The primer will also raise the wood grain, so after it has cured, you will want to sand it with 220 grit sandpaper just to maintain that smooth surface that you're going for. I also applied a coat of white paint on top afterward, as I was going for a white marble countertop. If any of the substrate were to show through the epoxy, I just wanted to start with a nice opaque countertop to begin with. Now that the countertop is painted, ready to go, we are masking off the wall and the cabinetry just to protect the surrounding areas, getting ready for this first pour. First, I'm applying a strip of delicate masking tape right up at the top edge of the cabinetry. This will be a little bit more gentle to the cabinetry and won't pull off any paint after we're done. And then I'm going to come back in and secure the plastic drop cloth directly onto this delicate masking tape. Now this plastic sheeting is pretty thick. You don't want to risk getting a hole in it, having any epoxy run onto your cabinetry. That would just be so sad and you'd have a lot of repairs to do. So I'm just rolling it out on the front edge of the counter and then cutting it. It's just going to make it a little bit easier to have the right size before securing it into place. Use just a few short strips of tape to initially hang the plastic into place. Then you'll want to come back in and mask off the entire edge of the plastic to prevent any epoxy from slipping in and running into the cabinetry. After watching a lot of different tutorials and having practiced on some smaller scale pieces, I decided to implement this tape dam method. It's going to keep the majority of the epoxy on the surface of the countertop until it gets to be a gel-like consistency, and then it will keep most of the epoxy on the surface without it all running off at once. Now I'm applying a separate piece of tape, attaching the sticky sides together and folding it over. This is going to make it a little bit easier when I'm removing the tape dam because it won't stick to my gloves. And the only reason why I'm using this delicate tape here is because I ran out of my green frog tape. So it really doesn't matter what you use. You're just masking off the sticky part so it's a little bit more manageable while you're working. When I got to the ends of the countertop, I just wanted to make sure that this tape dam was nice and strong, so I used a little bit more tape here to really make sure that none of the epoxy would pour out until I was ready to pull it down. Now we are ready for our first pour, and a couple of key things to remember. You'll want to just double check per brand resin that you're using, but you do need a consistent temperature to make sure that this cures properly. Not only does the epoxy and the room need to be the same temperature, but your substrate needs to be the same temperature as well. We are using the Makerpoxy by Total Boat, and we have labeled our buckets and stir sticks part A and part B, just so we don't mix things up, and we are mixing a 1-to-1 ratio. After parts A and B have been measured out, we are going to empty the contents of both into a larger mixing bucket. Using a stir stick, you can scrape the sides out really well and get every last drop of the resin out. When you have both parts in the same bucket, we're going to mix for 3 to 5 minutes. Again, you want to pay special attention to scrape the bottom of the bucket and the sides just so it gets mixed thoroughly. After that time frame is up, we're actually going to transfer it into another bucket and mix for an additional 2 to 3 minutes. This is just going to make sure that we have all parts mixed thoroughly in case there were some left in the bottom of the bucket. You also don't want to stir too quickly because that can increase the amount of bubbles in the mixture, so doing it by hand really is the best method. Now that the epoxy is mixed clear, we are just divvying it up into smaller buckets so that we can color some of the smaller buckets, and then we'll leave the majority of the epoxy for our white pigment. For the darker gray, I'm using the aluminum mica powder, and I will tell you, this is just live and learn. I did practice a bunch on several smaller scale pieces, but until you have the chance to work on a larger scale, like the real countertop, you just have to kind of play with how much you mix up. And this first pour, wasn't really what I was going for. I ended up mixing too much gray and my counter was more gray than white, but that's all right. You're gonna see how it looks and what we do to get it the way that I wanted. So I've got a bucket mixed with white pigment dispersion, and this is an opaque white, so that will be nice for the base for the marbling. And I'm adding the aluminum mixture into this bucket. I'm going for a dirty pour. Watched a few different methods online. I'm also adding some silver pearl and micro pearl pigment powder mixtures to this as well. I gave this mixture a tiny stir. See, like not very much at all. But then you see when I'm pouring it out, it does look really cool, but it is very gray. And I was really trying to go for more of a white marble with a little bit of gray. So again, I'm living and learning with this pour. Because it is much more gray than I was anticipating, I'm trying to spread it over the entire counter surface, and the plan was to put lighter mixtures on top of it to just try to mix everything together and get it coherent across the entire counter. Once I had all of the epoxy down on the counter, I was able to manipulate it with the heat gun and the chip brushes to just kind of blend everything in a little bit better. So this did help a lot. It did create a really cool look to it. Again, it was just a little bit darker than I had been anticipating. So this is after our initial dirty pour. It looks pretty cool. However, it's a little busier than I was anticipating. I went a little heavy on the gray. So you could definitely leave it like this if that's the look you're going for, but it's just a little bit busy for what I was going for. So we're going to fix this with our next pour. And we were gonna do another pour anyway, just to have durability and depth and dimension with all the layers. So I just want to point out a couple of our learning curves here. This is for our undermount sink. This side turned out really beautiful. Have a little bit of the drip there that we will take care of after. On this side, you see some issues, and I will tell you what happened. We actually had the epoxy a little deeper on this side, and so it increased the exotherm, which made it cure faster. So when we got to the part to pull off our tape dam, it was already hard and it didn't flow. So to correct this, we are going to sand this down. We're going to sand all of this flush to the counter, and we're just gonna do another pour, and that will fix our problem. If you're going to be sanding epoxy, be sure to wear a face mask because you don't want to breathe this in. I'm also spraying it lightly with water. This will just help keep the dust particles down as well. So right here I'm using a 60 grit piece of sandpaper, really knocking down that higher surface. And once I get it all level to the countertop, I'm going to go in with a 220 to get it nice and smooth. You can see here that in the process of sanding down the higher areas of epoxy, it did expose the wood a little bit, so I will have to come in and apply a little bit of primer to those areas. Now, I could have been really careful and applied the primer just on those spots, but I really was not happy with the way my first pour turned out. So I ended up giving the entire counter a very light coat of primer, and we are just starting over. But I'm so excited to show you the second method of this pour because I am extremely happy with the way my counter ended up turning out. I guess I needed that learning curve on my first pour. So be sure to stay tuned so you can see how I redeemed myself. After watching a few new tutorials, I found some methods that I was really anxious to try. For the previous pour, we mixed up 1 gallon at a time, and we just found that that really cut into our work time. And so this time we are going to mix up all 3 gallons at the same time. And to do this, we are going to just empty both half-gallon bottles into these buckets, let all of it drain out, and then we'll start mixing all 3 buckets at the same time. Now, we could have mixed all 3 gallons in a 5-gallon bucket, but by doing that, we increased the risk of the exotherm increasing, and it would have gotten the epoxy too hot. So that's why we are mixing in 3 separate buckets, just 1 gallon per bucket. We recruited more helping hands this time around, and we're mixing all 3 gallons at the same time. Again, the first batch for 3 to 5 minutes, and then we will transfer each of these into another bucket and give it another mix for 2 to 3 minutes more. Once it's mixed, again, I'm just going to pour several small cups of clear so we have those ready to mix with our different pigment colors. I was really trying to be a lot more prepared this go around because I learned my lesson. So I put the pigment powder in the cups first, poured the clear epoxy in, and then I was able to mix up the mica powders a little bit better. I had the ratio of powder per bucket was a lot more accurate this time around. I also mixed up a lot less coloring than the previous time and left most of it for the white. You can see the white pigment dispersion being mixed in the 2-gallon buckets right there. So most of the epoxy was white with just a little bit of coloring this time. To ensure that the full batch was thoroughly mixed and it was a nice opaque white, we are pouring it into another bucket, just like we did when it was clear, just to make sure that we can scrape out any clear resin from the bottom of the bucket and we can mix it all thoroughly. We are going for a dirty pour again, but this time it went so much better. So this time we're lining out 6 buckets in a row. I am putting a very small amount of the gray in every other bucket to start with. Then we're going to fill up all 6 cups with the white pigment, and we're going to fill the buckets up about halfway with the white. Then I'm going to come back in with the dark gray and add a small amount into all 6 buckets. Then I'm going to add another layer of white about halfway again into each of the 6 buckets. And you can see in the clip here, as I'm adding the white, I'm pouring on the right side of the bucket, moving it towards the left a little bit and back to the right again. And that's essentially just going to mix it a tiny bit. And that's all I want to do. Now for the last coloring I'm going to add to these buckets is a little bit of micro pearl to the top of all 6 buckets. And we're ready to pour again. This time I feel much more confident. I'm starting in the corner and I am still doing like a zigzag pattern, but I'm trying to get all of the epoxy from one bucket over a majority of the countertop just to make sure that I have all of the coloring on all parts of the countertop. I'm going to empty all 6 buckets like this, trying to get a little bit of each bucket over all parts of the counter, and I'm also filling in the voids of the zigzag where I did my previous pour, and the epoxy is going to self-level, so all of this is going to fill in nicely, and it's going to look so much more natural this way. After all of the buckets have been emptied, I'm using my gloved hand and I'm just breaking the surface tension. The epoxy does self-level, so it will eventually flow to all the areas of the countertop, but by rubbing the counter, I'm just getting the surface wet, and that's going to help the epoxy flow to those dry surfaces a little bit better. So you want to make sure to especially look for dry areas against the wall and also the tape dam. If you find there are any areas that need a little bit more epoxy, there's generally still some in the buckets, so you can just add that extra epoxy where needed. If you notice any areas that have some small dimpling, that's essentially just a dry spot, so you can just tap it with your gloved finger and it will fill in just like you did rubbing, breaking the surface tension. Now we're using our Wagner heat gun to pop any air bubbles, bring the air to the surface, and also just to help fan out the design and make it look a little bit more natural. Before I try to manipulate any of the coloring with the heat gun, I just quickly go over a workable surface to warm up the epoxy a little bit, pop the bubbles initially, and then I can use the gun to push the epoxy around. For the most part, I let the dirty pour do all of the marbling effect, but back here in the corner, I did use my stir stick to kind of just draw on a more opaque vein to the marbling, just to give it a little bit more detail. After about an hour, I was done manipulating the veins with the heat gun. The epoxy was starting to gel up a little bit, so it was time to take the tape dam off. And you can see it's moving a little bit slower now, running down the edges of the countertop. Again, you'll want to use a gloved finger and just break the surface tension again to help the epoxy flow over the side of the counter nicely. And this is where it gets really fun to watch because the design is going to start to come over the front edge a little bit as well. You don't want to pull the tape too early or too much of your design is going to come off of the countertop, but if it's dripping slower, running slower, you're probably safe to move on to this step. This is also where it gets a little bit satisfying, just sitting and watching the epoxy drip. I don't know what it is about it, but it's just cool. Look how slow that drip is, and you can tell that it's just starting to set up, and that means I made it through a successful pour. Now, there are a variety of methods out there for taking care of these drips. You can either just let them cure as is and then sand them down after it's cured, or after a couple hours, you can take a putty knife and just come along the bottom edge and run the putty knife on the countertop, and it will take care of the drips. It's totally up to you. At this point, I was just glad I made it through and that I was really pleased with the way it looked, so I just didn't want to mess with it, and I let those drips be, and I came back and sanded them after the fact. So totally up to you how you want to handle the edges. After this layer of epoxy cured, we did do one final coat of epoxy. When you're using the mica powders, it's not food safe, so we did one last coat of clear epoxy to cover the entire surface of the counter to make it food safe, and this also just added another layer of protection, and it made the design of the marbling look even more realistic because it added more depth and dimension. Thanks so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video, and more than that, we hope that you were able to learn a few new things and that we were able to give you the vote of confidence to try this in your own home. It was a little bit intimidating, but I am so glad I did it, and I would definitely do it again. I'm so happy with the way it turned out. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any upcoming episodes in our one room challenge. And as always, here at Sunnyside Design, we hope to bring your home to the sunny side of the street.